The first thing people noticed about her was that she was always late. Not very late. Not the kind of late that made instructors stop and stare. Just a few minutes. Just enough to slide into the back row without being properly seen. She would drop her bag on the floor with a soft thud and pull out a dented metal cup filled with something hot and dark, and she would sit there with her eyes half open like a creature that had not yet decided whether it wanted to be awake or not. Her name was Lyra Voss. She was human. She was 34 years old, and aboard the interstellar academic vessel Celesta Magna, she was without question the least impressive student in the entire Xenodiplomacy program. This was not a small thing to say. The Celesta Magna carried over 3,000 students from more than 40 different species. There were Solhari students who could process 6 streams of information at the same time. There were Vreth students whose stone-gray bodies were so large they had to sit in reinforced seats and whose minds were like ancient libraries filled with centuries of memorized law and history. There were Doneri students who could feel the emotions of everyone in a room and understand a person more deeply in 10 seconds than most species could in 10 years. And then there was Lyra Voss sitting in the back row looking like she had forgotten what planet she came from. She was not tall. She was not striking. She had short dark hair that she never seemed to bother fixing and pale brown skin that had a faint grayish tone to it like someone who had spent a long time in places without sunlight. Her uniform was always slightly wrinkled. Not badly. Not disrespectfully. Just enough to suggest that pressing it had been a low priority that morning. Her eyes were dark and calm, and they moved slowly around a room the way water moves when it is very deep and very still. She was not stupid. That much became clear early. When instructors asked questions, she sometimes answered, and her answers were always correct. But she gave them the way a person gives away something they do not particularly value, flat, quiet, without decoration. And then she would go back to her cup and her half-open eyes, and the rest of the class would move on. Her academic scores were average. Not failing. Not brilliant, average, sitting exactly in the middle of every ranking sheet like she had measured the middle very carefully and decided that was where she wanted to be. Professor Kellenuth was her academic advisor. He was a Solhari. 6 limbs. A mind like a precision instrument. He had advised students for 40 years, and he had a particular gift for identifying talent early. He met with Lyra at the start of the semester in his small office, filled with stacked data tablets and the faint smell of something chemical and sharp. He asked her about her goals. She said she wanted to understand how different species talked to each other when things went wrong. He asked her what her background was. She said she had done some work before coming here. Government adjacent. He asked her to be more specific. She smiled at him. It was a patient smile. The kind a person gives when they have answered a question 100 times and found that the answer never satisfies anyone, so they have stopped trying. She said old work. That is all. Kellenuth wrote in his private notes that evening that she was a kind creature, but unlikely to distinguish herself. He did not feel bad about writing it. He had been right about students for 40 years. He had no reason to think he was wrong now. The student who sat nearest to Lyra in most classes was a Doneri named Sereth. Sereth was young and curious, and her skin shifted through faint colors, the way still water shifts when light moves across it. She was an empath, which meant she did not just understand emotion intellectually. She felt it. She lived inside the edges of other people's feelings the way most people live inside air. On the 3rd day of class, Sereth sat down beside Lyra and immediately felt something strange. Not the drowsy, comfortable blankness that Lyra projected on the outside. Something underneath. Something that had been packed down very tightly and stored somewhere deep and was not moving at all. It did not feel like sadness. It did not feel like happiness. It felt like a room that had been locked for a very long time, and the person who had the key had decided they did not need to go inside anymore. Sereth did not say anything about it. She just noticed. She did ask about the tattoo. It was on Lyra's left forearm, partially visible when her sleeve slipped back. Dark ink, a symbol that Sarah did not recognize. It looked old. Not faded the way old tattoos fade from neglect. Faded the way things fade when they have been through something. Heat, maybe. Or time, or both. Lyra looked down at it when Sarah pointed to it. Then she looked back up. Old job, she said. Sarah waited to see if more was coming. Nothing came. Lyra took a sip from her cup. The student who had the least patience for Lyra was a Vreth named Varandolasi. He was young for a Vreth, which still made him older than most of the other students by 2 decades. He came from a noble family. His people had been part of the Galactic Collegiate Accord since its founding. He wore that history the way some people wear expensive clothes, visibly, deliberately. He found humans, puzzling in a way that annoyed him. They were so new, so small, so strangely soft. They had only been Accord members for 30 years, and yet they walked around on the ship as if they belonged here the same as everyone else. He did not hate them. He simply did not take them seriously. The way a person does not take seriously a child who insists on sitting at the adults' table. One afternoon in the second week, Lyra mispronounced a Vreth ceremonial term during a class discussion. She said it the wrong way. The sounds were close, but the meaning shifted entirely, and what she said instead of the correct, diplomatic phrase was something closer to a mildly insulting observation about a person's ancestry. Varandolasi laughed. Several students laughed. Lyra blinked at the board and then looked at her datapad and said, "Oh," and corrected herself. She did not look embarrassed. She did not look upset. She looked like a person who had noted a small error and moved on. Like someone who had a very long list of things to care about and this was not on it. That was the part that bothered Varandolasi more than anything else. Most people reacted when they were laughed at. They got small or they got defensive. Lyra just took a sip of her drink. It was at the end of that same week that Commander Yath, the Xenohistory instructor, announced something to the class. He said that in the following week they would be viewing recently declassified military footage from the Human Earth Coalition. It documented something called the Keth incursion. 30 years ago, the war that had happened just before humanity joined the Accord. Most students nodded and wrote it down. Lyra did not write it down. She stopped moving entirely for just a moment. Her cup was halfway to her mouth and it stayed there. Her eyes, which were always slow and calm, went somewhere else entirely. Somewhere very far away. Then she put the cup down, quietly, and looked at the desk. Nobody noticed. Nobody except Sarah, who felt the room inside Lyra shift. Just The classroom was dimmer than usual. Commander Yath had lowered the lights the way instructors do when they want the room to feel like something important is about to happen. He stood at the front with his long Doneri fingers, resting on the edge of the display panel, and he looked out at the students with the expression of someone who had seen this footage before and already knew what it was going to do to them. He said today they were going to look at history. Not the clean kind that sits in books, the kind that happened to real people in real places and left marks on the world that had not fully healed even now. Then he pressed play. The footage opened on a planet that looked like it had been beautiful once. There were the remains of structures, long curved buildings the color of pale stone, wide open plazas that had probably held markets or gatherings. Trees that had been tall enough to reach the lower windows of the buildings and were now black and broken at strange angles. The planet was called Kareth 4. It had been a human colony world. 70,000 people, families, children, farmers and engineers and teachers and people who had simply gone there to start something new far from wherever they had started. The narrator spoke in a calm, flat voice over the images. It explained that the Keth Dominion had arrived without warning. That their method of invasion was to move fast and overwhelm and leave nothing standing that could resist them. That they had already destroyed 3 civilizations before reaching human space. That the Galactic Collegiate Accord had attempted diplomatic contact with the Keth 17 times. That every attempt had failed. That by the time the Keth reached the edge of human territory, The Accord had run out of options and quietly decided that this particular war was not theirs to fight. Humanity had received no help. No ships, no soldiers, no weapons. Just a formal message of sympathy from the Accord Council and a suggestion that humans consider evacuation of border worlds. Xenodiplomacy shifted in his seat. He did not look comfortable. The footage moved forward in time. It showed the human response. And this was where the classroom began to change. The students had expected soldiers. They got soldiers, but they also got something else. Something that did not fit neatly into the frameworks most of them had used to understand warfare. The humans fought in ways that made no logical sense on paper and yet kept working. They used darkness as a weapon when they had no power systems left. They used sound and silence and confusion in ways that disrupted Keth formations that should have been impossible to disrupt. They moved through environments that should have been unsurvivable. Radiation zones. Collapsing structures. Temperatures that the Keth medical assessments had flagged as lethal for soft-bodied species. The humans kept going. A Solhari student in the front row leaned forward very slowly. Her 6 limbs were very still. She was watching with the kind of attention she usually reserved for mathematical problems that did not have obvious solutions. The footage showed field hospitals where human medics worked for hours without rest and then kept working. It showed communication officers maintaining coordination across broken networks with improvised equipment and hand signals, and in one case a series of fires lit on hillsides in patterns. It showed engineers building fortifications out of wreckage so fast that Keth forces who had mapped a position at dawn found a completely different defensive structure by midday. It showed humans being afraid. That was something the class had not expected. The footage did not hide it. There were faces full of fear, shaking hands, people crying before going back out, and then going back out anyway. That detail landed differently than anything else. Sereth, the Domeri empath, had her eyes closed. She was not watching the screen. She was feeling the room. The class around her had gone from mild academic interest to something tighter and quieter. A kind of collective discomfort that comes when a species you had not taken seriously suddenly appears in a light that makes you reconsider every assumption you have ever held about them. She felt all of that. And then she felt something else. Something coming from the back of the room. It was not loud. Emotions rarely are when they are very old and very deep. This one was like standing near something massive in the dark. You could not see it clearly, but you could feel the size of it, the weight of it, the age of it. She opened her eyes and turned around. Lyra Voss was sitting perfectly still. Not the lazy, comfortable stillness of someone half asleep. A different kind of still. The kind that a person arrives at after learning that stillness is how you survive. Her cup was on the desk untouched. Her data pad was closed. Her hands were flat on the table and her eyes were on the screen, and she was not blinking very much. Her posture had changed. It was a small change. The kind most people would not notice. The slight forward angle of her back. The way her shoulders had settled down and back into a position that was not relaxed but was precise. The way her jaw had a very faint set to it. She looked like a completely different person. Not a student. Not a tired woman in a wrinkled uniform sitting in the back row. Something else. On the screen, the footage entered a new phase. The narrator explained that what followed documented one of the most significant engagements of the entire Keth incursion. A location in the southern hemisphere of a colony world called Varda 3, a flat open plain that had been used for agriculture. A place that had no particular military value except that it sat between the last functioning human evacuation point and the main Keth advance. Someone had decided to hold it. The footage showed a small unit taking position across the plain. The camera was mounted on a fixed point high above, and the resolution had degraded badly over 30 years, but the shapes of soldiers were clear enough. The narrator said the unit designation was VSS-7, 9 soldiers. Against an estimated 4,000 Keth ground forces. The narrator said they held the position for 6 days. The class was very quiet. Then the footage shifted to closer range. A ground-level camera somewhere. Smoke and low gray light and the sounds of things burning at a distance. And a soldier moving through the frame giving orders, young, lean, covered in ash, and dried blood on the left side of her face. Her helmet was gone. Her voice was completely steady. She pointed. She directed. She spoke and people moved and the whole broken, exhausted unit reorganized around her like water finding a new shape. The camera caught her arm for just a moment. A tattoo, dark ink. A unit insignia. And below it in standard military print the designation. VSS-7. Voss El Sereth did not breathe. Her head turned slowly toward the back of the room. The woman in the back row had not moved. She was still watching the screen. Her face had not changed. But her eyes were doing something that Sereth could not look away from. They were not sad. They were not proud. They were the eyes of someone watching something they had already lived through once and survived, and were now being asked to live through again in a room full of strangers. Xenodiplomacy had not yet turned around. He was still watching the screen, still watching the young soldier in the ash directing 9 people against. Sarah said it quietly, just above a breath. Voss El was not meant to carry. But the room was so silent that it did. It moved through the air like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples reached every corner of the classroom before anyone had decided how to react. Heads turned, one at a time and then all at once. First the students near Sereth, then the ones further along the rows. Then Xenodiplomacy, whose large gray head moved slowly like something turning against resistance. And then every pair of eyes in the room was looking at the back row. At the tired woman with the dented cup and the wrinkled uniform. On the screen behind them, the young soldier was still moving. Still calling out positions. Still redirecting the broken pieces of her unit with the quiet, focused certainty of someone who had decided that as long as she was breathing, the line was not going to move. The sound of the footage filled the silence. Low, distant fire. Short, controlled commands in a language most of the class understood as standard but delivered in a cadence and tone that felt like a different language entirely. The language of someone who had removed everything unnecessary from communication and kept only what kept people alive. Lyra did not look at her classmates. She watched the screen. Commander Yath pressed pause. The image froze. The young soldier mid-step in the ash. Arm raised. Mouth open. Eyes forward. Yath looked at Lyra. He had known. He had always known. Her enrollment file had been very clear to anyone with the clearance to read the full version. He had chosen this footage deliberately. He had not done it to expose her. He had done it because 40 years of teaching history had taught him that history becomes real when it has a face, when it stands in the same room as you. He said her name. Just her name, Lyra. She looked at him. He turned to the class. He spoke in the slow, careful way of someone laying something fragile on a table. He said that Sergeant-Major Lyra Voss received the Earth Coalition highest military honor at the age of 22, that the honor was called the Ashen Cross, that it had only been given to 11 people in the entire history of the Human Earth Coalition, that she had earned it at a place called the Ashfall Plains on Varda 3, where she and 8 other soldiers had held a defensive position for 6 days and 6 nights against an enemy, force that outnumbered them by a factor that most military theorists still used in academic papers as an example of something that should not have been survivable. He said she had been 21 years old when the battle started. Nobody spoke. Xenodiplomacy was looking at Lyra with an expression that had no name in most languages. It was the look of a person whose internal map of the world has just been handed back to them with large sections redrawn. He looked at her face. Her ordinary face. Her tired, unremarkable face. He looked at her forearm where the sleeve had slipped and the tattoo was visible now with the unit. Insignia clear and the letters faded but legible. He thought about the afternoon he had laughed at her mispronunciation. He thought about the way she had simply looked at her datapad and said, "Oh." He thought about all the small moments in the past weeks where he had watched her and thought how very unimpressive she was. He felt something he was not used to feeling. A Solhari student near the front raised one of her upper limbs, slightly, which was her species' way of asking permission to speak. Commander Yath nodded. She asked why Lyra had never said anything. The room waited. Lyra finally looked away from the frozen image on the screen. She looked at the Solhari student. Then she looked at the room. All those faces turned toward her. Different shapes. Different colors. Different species and histories and ways of understanding the world. All of them looking at her now the way they had never looked at her in all the weeks before. She picked up her cup. She took a slow sip. She said, "You did not ask." It was not said with anger. It was not said with pride. It was said the way a person states something obvious that has simply been overlooked. Clean and flat and completely without performance. And somehow that made it land harder than anything dramatic could have. Sareth felt the room change again. The discomfort deepened, but it was not the sharp kind. It was the heavy kind. The kind that comes from understanding something about yourself that you would rather not understand. Every student in that room had looked at this woman every day for weeks and seen what they expected to see. A tired human. An average student. A harmless, unremarkable creature from a young and unimpressive species. They had not asked. None of them had asked. Sarah thought about what she had felt when she first sat next to Lyra, that locked room. That deep, packed-down stillness beneath the surface. She understood now what was stored in there. Not bitterness. Not resentment. Just weight. Just the particular kind of weight that belongs to someone who has been through something that most people never have to survive, and came out the other side and then chose to get up every morning and be ordinary. To sit in the back row. To mispronounce words. To let people laugh. To let people underestimate her completely. Because she was not here to be a soldier. She was done being a soldier. She was here to learn something different. Something harder in its own way. How to prevent the things she had been trained to do from ever being necessary again. Xenodiplomacy spoke. His voice was different from how it usually was, quieter. The noble polish of it was still there, but underneath the polish was something genuine and uncertain. He asked her a question. He said he had been told that human soldiers in the incursion received minimal support from their governments in the final stages of the war. That resources had been stretched? He asked if that was true. Lyra looked at him for a moment. Then she said yes. He asked if she had known that at the time. At the Ashfall Plains. Had she known that nobody was coming? A pause. She said by day 2 we knew. The words sat in the air. By day 2 they had known that no reinforcements were on the way. That they were 9 people on a flat open plain with limited ammunition and no air support and an enemy force that had destroyed 3 other civilizations and was not going to be moved by anything except force. And they had held anyway. For 6 days. Not because they believed rescue was coming, but because behind them was the last evacuation corridor and the people moving through it needed time. So they gave them time. Xenodiplomacy looked down at his desk. He did not speak again for a while. Commander Yath was about to resume the footage when every screen in the classroom flickered. The frozen image of young Lyra in the ash was replaced by a sharp red border and a scrolling line of text, and a sound that every species on the ship recognized regardless of language. Emergency alert. Unknown vessel approaching at combat speed. No response to communication. Configuration not matching any registered species in a core database. All non-essential personnel advised to move to interior sections. The classroom erupted into noise and movement. Every student stood. Some moved toward the door. Some stood frozen. Some began talking quickly in their own languages. The alert kept scrolling. The sound kept pulsing. Commander Yath was speaking, but his voice was being swallowed by the noise. Sareth turned to the back row. Lyra Voss was already standing. She was not rushing. She was not panicking. She was looking at the description on the scrolling alert with narrowed eyes and her head tilted very slightly to one side. She read the configuration details. Her expression did something that Sareth could not fully interpret. It was not fear. It was not surprise. It was something older and much more complicated. She knew that ship. She had seen that configuration before, a long time ago, in a different life, on a burning plane covered in ash. She picked up her bag, not hurriedly, efficiently, then she walked toward. The corridors of the Celesta Magna were not built for panic, but panic had moved in anyway. Students from a dozen species filled the passageways in clusters. Some moved fast. Some stood against walls with their hands pressed to communication devices trying to reach people. Some just stood in the middle of the corridor doing nothing because their bodies had not yet received instruction from their minds about what to do. The emergency sound pulsed through everything, low and rhythmic and relentless, like a second heartbeat that did not belong to anyone. Lyra moved through all of it the way a current moves through water. Not fast enough to draw attention. Not slow enough to waste time. Just steady. Her bag over one shoulder. Her eyes moving across everything. Exits, junctions, ceiling panels. The placement of emergency equipment on the walls. She read the ship the way other people read text. Sareth followed her. She did not know why she followed. She just knew that whatever direction Lyra was moving was the direction that felt least like dying. Xenodiplomacy followed too. He told himself it was practical. That following the person who knew what was happening was the logical choice. He did not examine that thought very closely. The security station was 2 levels down. Lyra found it without checking the directory. She walked in to find 7 people all talking at the same time, and none of them listening to each other. At the center of the room behind a curved console covered in flashing panels was Brock Solon. He was Vreth, large, and solid and experienced in the routine management of a civilian, academic vessel and completely unprepared for whatever was currently approaching his ship at combat speed. He had his hands on the console and he was reading the configuration data on the incoming vessel, and his expression was the expression of someone reading a language they do not speak. Lyra stopped in the doorway. Brock Solon looked up and saw a human woman in a slightly wrinkled uniform holding a canvas bag. He was about to tell her to go to an interior section. She spoke first. She asked him what his shield geometry looked like on the starboard side and whether the forward array was at full output or running on standby protocol. He stopped. She asked him how many crew members he had with any weapons, training and where they were currently positioned, and whether the communication blackout that had started 8 minutes ago was affecting all frequencies or only the outer band. He stared at her. She met his eyes and held them. Not aggressively, not impatiently. The way a person holds eye contact when they need you to understand very quickly that this is not the moment for questions about who they are. Brock Solon was not a stupid person. He had managed this vessel for 11 years. He had handled medical emergencies and equipment failures and student crises of many varieties. He knew the shape of competence. He had simply never expected to find it standing in his doorway wearing a civilian enrollment badge and carrying a canvas bag. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he answered her questions. All of them. Accurately and in order. She nodded. She walked to the console. She did not push him aside. She stood beside him and started working through the information the same way. She had moved through the corridor steadily, without wasted motion. She said the starboard shield geometry needed to be collapsed inward on the lower quarter. She said the forward array being on standby was actually useful and she did not want it changed. She asked him to pull up the internal map and mark every location that currently had more than 20 non-combatants in a single room. He did all of it. Behind her, Sareth had come in quietly and pressed herself against the wall. Xenodiplomacy stood in the doorway. His large frame filled it completely. He watched Lyra work, and he had the look of someone watching something they had been told could not exist. and was existing anyway directly in front of them. 3 other students had followed them without anyone meaning for it to happen. Then 4 more arrived. Then 2 crew members who had seen the group forming and made the same decision Brock Solon had made. That this was where the information was. Lyra did not tell anyone to leave. She did not have time to. She started allocating. She pointed at one of the crew members and told him to take non-combatants from the 3 largest gathering points and move them to the inner cargo sections on level 6. Not the passenger quarters, cargo, better walls. No exterior panels. She pointed at a student she recognized from class. A quiet Solhari who had never said much in lectures, but who Lyra had watched and identified weeks ago as someone precise and quick. She told him to go to the communication array on level 3 and start cycling through secondary and tertiary frequencies. Not to send messages, just to map where the blackout was thickest. She needed that information in 10 minutes. She pointed at 2 crew members and gave them positions near the 2 main entry corridors. She told them what to do if anyone approached and what to do if no one did. She told them exactly what it looked like and what it did not look like and the difference between the 2. Xenodiplomacy still stood in the doorway. She looked at him. She said she needed someone to manage the flow of students coming down from the upper levels, to stop people bunching at junctions, to keep movement steady and keep people from sitting in corridors near exterior walls. She said she had watched him for weeks and he was the person in their class that other students looked at when they were scared. She did not say this as a compliment. She said it as a fact, like noting that a tool was well suited to a particular task. Xenodiplomacy looked at her for one long moment. Then he turned and went. Sereth stayed. Lyra let her. Sereth was not a fighter and not a technician, but she could feel the emotional state of every person on the ship, like weather moving across a plain, and that information was not nothing. The next 30 minutes were the strangest of Sereth's life. She stood near Lyra and felt the whole ship through her empathic senses and watched Lyra work and tried to understand what she was witnessing. It was not loudness. It was not the dramatic commanding presence she had seen in fictional accounts of military figures. Lyra did not raise her voice once. She did not give speeches. She did not reassure anyone with words. She just made the right decisions at the right speed and told the right people the right things. And the ship reorganized itself around her the way a scattered group of people reorganize around someone who knows where the exit is. Sereth felt the fear in the ship gradually change shape. It did not go away, but it became smaller, contained, like fire moved from an open field into a controlled space. And then Lyra said something that stopped the room. She looked at the configuration data on the incoming vessel one more time. She read the approach pattern. She read the weapon signature. She looked at the communication blackout map that the Solhari student had sent back from level 3. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It is not attacking. It is following a program. It does not know we are here." Brock Solon asked her what she meant. She said the configuration was Keth, old Keth, decommissioned class from 30 years ago. Automated war vessel running on residual programming from an empire that no longer existed. It was not a new enemy. It was a ghost. A machine that had been wandering this sector for 3 decades, doing what it had been told to do when it was built and had simply never been told to stop. She said if they powered down non-essential systems, the ship's profile would drop below the vessel's targeting threshold. It would pass them. It would not fire. It did not have a reason to fire. It was not thinking. It was just running silence. Brock Solon asked her how she knew. She looked at the screen, at the shape of that old vessel moving through the dark. She said, "Because I have seen them up close. I know how they move. I know what they look for." She said, "I spent 6 days learning everything about them that I could, because if I did not, I was going to die, and I was not going to let that happen." She said, "Power down the non-essentials." "Do it now." Brock Solon powered them down. The ship went quieter, darker. The emergency pulse faded. Everyone held very still. The incoming vessel moved across their sensors, slow, vast, ancient. It did not stop. It did not turn. It passed. The screens cleared. The alert ended. The lights came back. Nobody cheered. The room just breathed. Lyra picked up her bag from where she had set it on the floor. She checked that the Solhari student had gotten safely back from level 3. She confirmed with Verundalasi through the comm that the upper-level corridors were clear. She told Broxolan to file a report with Accord Navigation about the vessel's last known trajectory so someone could finally send it a proper shutdown command. Then she walked out of the security station. She found an empty side corridor. She sat down on the floor against the wall. She put her bag on her knees and her arms on her bag and her head on her arms. And she breathed. Long and slow and shaking just slightly. The way a person breathes when they have held something very tightly for a very long time and have finally been given one quiet moment to put it down. Nobody saw it? Nobody except Sereth, who had followed again and who stood at the entrance of the corridor and felt everything Lyra was feeling in that moment and understood for the first time the full cost of what it meant to be exactly who Lyra Voss was. She did not go closer. She did not speak. The next morning came quietly. The Celesta Magna moved through space. The way it always had, steady, slow. The lights in the corridors came up on their normal cycle. The food halls opened. Students moved toward their classes in the ordinary patterns of an ordinary day. If you had arrived on the ship that morning, and known nothing about what had happened the night before, you would not have been able to tell that. Anything was different, but something was different. It was in the way people moved through doorways. The way conversations paused when certain people walked past. The way several students who had never spoken to each other stood together outside the Xenohistory classroom waiting for it to open. There was a quality to the air that morning that Sereth could feel from 3 corridors away. The specific feeling of a group of people who have shared something and have not yet found the words for it. Lyra arrived to class last. She was a few minutes late as always. Her uniform was wrinkled in the same places it was always wrinkled. She had her cup. Her hair was the same. Everything about her looked exactly as it had on every other morning. She walked to the back row. Every student in the classroom stood up. It was not planned. There had been no discussion. No signal. It happened the way breathing happens, because it was the only thing the body knew how to do in that moment. The Solhari student who had gone to the communication array the night before, the Denari classmates who had followed her through the corridors, the quiet ones from the middle rows who had done nothing special but had watched everything, even the 2 students who had been too far away from the security station to have been directly useful and had spent the crisis in an interior cargo room feeling helpless and ashamed about it. They all stood. Lyra stopped walking. She looked at the room. Something moved across her face. It was small and fast, and most people would have missed it. Sereth did not miss it. It was not pride. It was something closer to pain. The kind of pain that lives just underneath gratitude when you are not sure you deserve the gratitude and are not sure you know how to hold it. She said, "Sit down." They sat. She walked to her seat. She put her cup on the desk. She sat down. And for a moment, the room just held that silence the way cupped hands hold water. Commander Yath came in. He looked at the room. He understood immediately what had happened in the minutes before he arrived. He set his things down and he did not go to the display panel. He pulled a chair from behind the desk and placed it facing the class, and sat down in it. He said he wanted to try something different today. He said he wanted to ask Lyra a question, and he wanted to ask it in front of the class, not to embarrass her, but because he believed the answer was something everyone in the room needed to hear. He said she could refuse. He would not hold it against her. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. He asked her why she was here. Not what she was studying. Not what her academic goals were. He asked her why she had left a military career and a decorated record and whatever life she had been building after the war and had come to a classroom on an academic vessel to study. Xenodiplomacy? Lyra was quiet for a while, long enough that some students began to wonder if she was going to answer at all. Then she started talking. She did not look at anyone in particular. She looked at the space in front of her the way people look when they are not talking to a room but are talking to something they carry inside themselves. She said she wanted to tell them about the other 8 people at the Ashfall Plains, she said there. Names one at a time. 2 of them had been human. A man named Darrow, who had been a farmer before the war and had joined because his colony was in the invasion path, and he did not know what else to do. A woman named Priya, who had been 17 years old and had lied about her age on her enrollment forms, and who Lyra had known about and had said nothing because they needed everyone they had. 2 had been Doneri, volunteers from a border colony that sat between Doneri space and the edge of human territory. Their government had not sent them. Their government had in fact specifically told them not to go. They had gone anyway. Their names were Ven and Sorath, and they had stood on a human plane for 6 days fighting a war that was not officially theirs because they had decided that watching from a distance was not something they were able to do. 1 had been Vreth, a mercenary named Cole, who had been hired 2 weeks before the battle for completely different reasons and had ended up at the Ashfall Plains by a series of accidents and had then simply stayed. He had not been paid to stay. There was no longer anyone to pay him. He had stayed because by day 3 the unit had become something, and he was part of it, and leaving would have made him less than he needed to be. 1 had been a Solhari medic named Issa, who should not have been in a combat zone at all, and who had saved 6 of the 9 of them at least once each, and whose hands had never once stopped moving for the entire 6 days. The 3 remaining had been human. Lyra said she said their names because they did not get mentioned in the official account very often. The official account mentioned her. It mentioned the Ashen Cross. It mentioned the number of days and the odds and the outcome. It did not mention that Ven the Doneri had spent the last night of the battle sitting beside a wounded human soldier he had never met before the war and had held his hand and talked to him quietly in a language the human could not understand because the sound of a calm voice was the only comfort available. And Ven had understood that without being told. It did not mention that Cole the Vreth mercenary had used his own body as a shield at the end of day 4 and had survived it and had made a very short sound and then stood back up and kept going. It did not mention that 17-year-old Priya had been the one who first saw the evacuation signal at the end of day 6. That she had been the one who had turned to Lyra and said, "We did it," and had laughed. She had laughed. In all that ashen fire and exhaustion she had laughed. Lyra stopped talking for a moment. When she continued, her voice was the same, but her hands on the desk had pressed flat. She said the Accord had not come to help them. She said she understood why. The political situation had been what it was. The decisions made were made by people working with the information they had in the time they had to work with it. She said she did not carry bitterness about it, but she said she had stood on that plane with 2 Doneri who had come anyway, and 1 Vreth who had stayed anyway, and 1 Solhari who had refused to leave, and she had understood something. She said the galaxy was full of species who were capable of crossing the line between what they were required to do and what was right. That it was not a human quality. It was not a Doneri quality or a Vreth quality. It was something that lived in individuals regardless of species. Something that could not be mandated or trained into a person. It just existed, or it did not. She said she had come to study Xenodiplomacy because she wanted to understand how to build systems that made it easier for that quality to act. How to build the kind of connections between species that meant the next time a colony world burned, there would be more than 9 people standing between it and the fire. Not because they were ordered to, because the relationships between their peoples made it unthinkable to do otherwise. She said she was tired of the kind of bravery that only happened because everything else had already failed. She said she wanted to learn how to make things not fail in the first. Sergeant-Major had been sitting with his arms on the desk and his head slightly bowed since she began speaking. He raised it now. He looked at her, and he said something in Old Vreth first, the formal version of the language, the one used for significant occasions. Then he translated it. He said his people had a word for someone who gives everything they have so that others are able to give nothing, who pays a price in full so that the debt does not exist for those who come after. He said the word had no clean equivalent in Galactic standard. The closest was something like the one who already went ahead. He said it quietly, and then he bowed his head again, deep, the kind of bow that among Vreth is not given to governments or titles or wealth, the kind that is given only to something genuine. Sereth reached across and touched Lyra's hand very briefly. Just a moment of contact. Among Doneri it meant I felt what you carried and I am glad you are still here. It was not a small thing to say. Lyra looked at Sereth's hand on hers. Then she looked up at Sereth. She nodded. Once. The class continued. Commander Yath moved the lesson forward. Notes were taken. Questions were asked. The ordinary machinery of learning resumed as it always does because life does not stop for its significant moments. It just keeps going around them. At the end of the session, students filed out. The room emptied slowly. People moved quietly as if they were leaving somewhere that deserved a certain care in the leaving. Lyra stayed in her seat. As she sometimes did, she had her cup. She was looking at nothing in particular. She had come here to learn something. She was still learning it. She did not know yet if she would learn it well enough to make the difference she wanted to make. She did not know if the understanding she was building here would ever translate into the kind of change that meant somewhere out there a 17-year-old would never have to lie about her age to defend her home, that 2 volunteers from another species would never have to go against their government's instructions to do what was obviously right, that a mercenary would never have to choose between payment and being the kind of person he could live with being. She did not know. But she was here, every day, in the back row, watching, listening, learning. The next semester started 3 weeks later. New students arrived. The Xenodiplomacy classroom filled again with unfamiliar faces from a variety of species. There was the usual first day, energy of people assessing each other and finding their bearings. In a new place, a young Solhari student, near the middle of the room, glanced at the back row and leaned toward the classmate beside him. He spoke quietly. He said that human in the back. She looks like she barely belongs here. His classmate was Sereth, who was now in her 2nd year and had chosen the same seat as the year before. Sereth looked at the back row, at the wrinkled uniform, the dented cup, the half-open eyes. She said nothing. She just smiled, small and private and facing forward. And in the back row, Lyra Voss took a slow sip of her coffee and let the world continue to see exactly what it expected to see, because she was not here to impress anyone. She had already paid that